Hey everybody, how's it going? I am here with Daniel Smullen. He is a PhD candidate. He is an engineer in training. He has worked with NASA, and he is here to answer a bunch of questions on this whole Apple privacy and security thing that has been going on in the news over the past few days, and clarify some things for people like me who are ignorant on certain areas. So just first thing, just going through your credentials list, I know what shows up in the comment section of my channel. What wrong turn did you take to end up in the comment section of this YouTube channel?
I mean, I was just trying to fix a bunch of MacBooks, you know? So, like, I figured I might as well go to the source of all the best MacBook repair knowledge that I knew. So, you know, why not just troll through a bunch of YouTube videos? But then eventually I found the comment section, and then I guess I decided to comment, and the rest is history.
That is very cool. I'm just going to do one clap for audio sync because sometimes this thing doesn't work in the audio recording, so I'm using a backup thing. Okay, so first things first to go over. What are the biggest misconceptions and pieces of confusion with regards to what this technology is, how it's been implemented, and what the privacy implications of it are that you've seen on the past few days?
Yeah. So this is kind of an interesting thing because it's really a big departure from what Apple has previously done, right? So I think that, you know, a lot of people got introduced to this idea of Apple as like a privacy-friendly company, rather. Sometime in what was it, like 2017, 2018, something like that, where there was this like San Bernardino terror attack, right? And, you know, everybody was, talking about how, Apple, in the face of, the FBI and of the man, they refused to, they refused to unencrypt the suspect's phone, right? So, from that point forward, Apple even caught my attention as a company that seems to, care about your privacy, and they do a lot of good stuff in that respect. But the biggest sort of issue here, which I think is very surprising for most people, even privacy and security experts, is that they've moved from, a kind of policy where it's, we won't do anything, we're not going to cooperate, we're just really going to like uphold your privacy first and foremost, to, well, now we're going to start scanning stuff that's on your device, right? So I mean, that was a shock. That was a shock for me. That's a shock, I think, amongst the community. But with the shock sort of wearing off a little bit, you kind of take a step back and you take a closer look at what they're actually doing, and then you start to try to answer some of the technical questions there, right? So some of the interesting, and I wouldn't call this a misconception, right, but maybe just sort of partial knowledge, is this idea that, for instance, the files that are going to be scanned on your device, your photos really, right, are going to be sort of hashed. And some people get this, knowledge about, well, what is hashing, right? And some people have this idea, oh yeah, it's you take all the data that's inside a file and you jumble it all up into like one small string of numbers or whatever, and then anytime you make any tiny change to the file, that hash changes, right? And that's correct. That is a correct definition of hashing, and that's useful because if you're trying to find out whether a file you downloaded over the internet is different in any way to the file that you were expecting, you would expect to see it to have a different hash, right? Now the problem here is that the language that's being used by Apple here, not intentionally, but it is misleading. And so they're using what's called a perceptual hashing technology. And that really has nothing to do with this sort of traditional definition of hashing at all. Really what it means is you're going to take photos and you're going to run it through essentially a neural network. And that neural network is going to spit out a bunch of numbers that represent certain features that they're looking for within the image. And features is a very general term here, right? Features could be, essentially whatever you want. It could be, how green the image is. It could be, is this image among a set of categories like, is it a dog, a cat, or like a plant, right? You get to design these features however you want because you get to design the machine learning algorithm, the neural network in this case, to actually generate, those classifications and whatever other features. And then they take these features and then they hash those. So what does this mean, right? Well, the idea here is that if you were to take an image of a person, right, like me, and then you were to, say, resize the image, or you were to edit like one pixel in the corner or whatever, right? From a human perspective, you wouldn't really notice any difference. It would look the same. And to a traditional hashing algorithm, it would look completely different, right? But to this perceptual hashing algorithm, it would look basically the same. They would hash it the same way. And so, you in theory would make the, this detection algorithm invariant to things like scaling the image or changing it around trivially, changing the color, whatever, right? So I think that's the first sort of misconception that I think people get about the way that this technology works, is that, in theory, if, Apple were to flag on your device something as child sexual abuse material, CSAM as they refer to it, right? Then, just simply changing it a little bit will probably make it so that it's not detected anymore. But again, that simply isn't how it works, right? Now, what Apple has done, and they've done actually a very remarkable job of this part of the design, is ensuring that this detection process and the communication of the details that underlie this process is done in a way that is private. And when I say private, I don't necessarily mean what many people might think of when they think of privacy, because of course they are still scanning stuff that's on your private device, your private files. They are being scanned. That's how this works, right? The communication of this information from sort of like a knowledge perspective is private when it comes to Apple, because essentially the way that these algorithms are designed is such that you don't know what they've scanned on your device. You don't know whether you've, triggered their detection mechanism or not. You also don't know what they're looking for. And I'll go into why that's a little bit scary as well, besides maybe the obvious reasons in just a moment. And you also don't know whether you've reached their also like unspecified threshold of whether or not you've set off their detection enough that they're now going to go and inform on you to the FBI or to this National Child Safety Center organization or whatever, right? So the cryptography and the math and all the fancy stuff that they've done, that they got a lot of really smart people, really smart engineers and scientists to work on, it seems pretty bulletproof. The problem is that the overall design of the system and what it is intended to do in the first place is fundamentally a violation of your privacy, right? So let's talk a little bit about how that works, right? And I mentioned that, they are not exactly telling you what they're looking for on your device. They're looking for child porn, right? But they obviously can't tell you what child porn they're looking for, because that would involve sharing the child porn. So they've come up with these, very clever algorithms that ensures that you can essentially see whether something that they've flagged as child porn's hash matches with the hash of a huge database of known child porn images. And then if there is a match, then, the way that it's supposed to work is that they'll sort of flag a human to be like, hey, like, does this look like it matches or whatever? And then I guess the human will either say yes or no. And then, if they say yes, then that means that you're gonna end up with, potentially the FBI knocking on your door, right? So, yeah, I mean, I know that's a lot, but there's a lot to be a little bit concerned about here.
All right, so the first misconception that I initially had with this whole thing. I think I set it up so that. Whoops. Okay, so I think that. Let me see if I mute you, if I can make the echo go away. All right. So the first misconception that I had was whether or not this was an exact hash or an algorithm, because they said it was hashing, but then they said neural learning, and what you explained there makes a lot of sense. And when I did some more research into it, it seems like, so if I take a picture of Mr. Clinton and I change it from a JPEG to a PNG, I make it grayscale, I enter one pixel in the middle of this 4K image that's aqua, that it doesn't say, okay, that's something totally different entirely. That's the point of it. And if somebody else takes the same picture with the same phone from the same thing, enough will be different that it won't be able to tell it. So what they're going to do is, and the other misconception that I had is scanning everything on the device versus only scanning things that were going to iCloud. Now
Yeah. So that's a really tricky one, because they've said for now that they will only scan stuff that, well, of course, is on your device, but is also backed up on iCloud, right? So this raises some really serious questions, because why would they bother scanning the stuff that's on your device if they could just scan it on iCloud? I mean, I think people sort of have this sort of already quite correct perception that if you upload something onto the internet, whether you upload it onto your Gmail or you put it onto Dropbox or, you know, whatever else, that's probably going to get scanned by the people that own these like file, you know, storage and sharing services. And they're already doing stuff to detect whether you're uploading things like pirated content or, you know, child sexual abuse material or whatever else, right? So, you know, what a lot of privacy and security experts are correctly saying here is, well, you know, what is the point of having this restriction? Because if they are already scanning the stuff on your device, and granted, they're doing all this fancy crypto stuff or whatever to ensure that the scanning is in theory done privately and whatever, why couldn't they just do it on iCloud? And it seems pretty transparent to me, in my opinion, and I want to be clear that all my opinions here are just my own, right? That they wouldn't be doing this if they weren't eventually planning to just only scan for stuff that's on your phone. And the reason why they would do this is because then they can still advertise that all of the stuff that's on the cloud is encrypted, which it is. And even the stuff on your phone may be encrypted, but they can still get access to it, right? So they're essentially almost claiming ownership over the data that's on your device in the sense that they are able to scan it. You don't have any way of opting out of this. Everybody uses iCloud. And if you don't, then you're very limited in terms of what backup options you have. So even from its initial rollout, it's questionable. But it's very likely, though, again, I'm sure that Apple would deny this, that they could just make this happen only on your device by itself anyway, because they don't really need the iCloud part for this to work.
What are the odds of a false positive occurring on these types of on this type of neural network hashing? Because I think that's a question that a lot of people ask.
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question because Apple's technical brief claims that this process has like a 1 in a trillion false positive rate, which actually sounds like, oh, then it's extremely unlikely, right? Although actually, if you think about it, given the fact that there's like trillions of images out there, that doesn't really sound so optimistic anymore. But that's just what they say. And they don't actually, in their technical brief, seem to back this with any real, like, you know, reasoning. Like, they don't tell you how they arrived at this, right? But from what I know, based on people, you know, that I've worked with in the past and that who, you know, have been close colleagues of mine at CMU, it's really, really easy to trick machine learning algorithms, right? Even if you don't necessarily know how the algorithm is coded, even if you don't necessarily fully know what it's doing or the data that it's operating on. I mean, let me sort of put this into perspective for a moment, right? So, you know, a good buddy of mine, Mahmoud, he did some really interesting research where essentially, without knowing anything about the machine learning model for facial recognition, he was able to design sunglasses that you could 3D print in like 10 minutes that would fool facial recognition algorithms into you being basically whoever you wanted. You could trick it into being a celebrity, whatever. And to a normal human, you'd look at the person and say, yeah, it's, you know, it's just Mahmoud wearing sunglasses. But the machine learning algorithms were very easily tricked. And so the issue here is that it's very, very easy to take approaches that can potentially trick the machine learning algorithm into thinking that something is a child porn image, right? And, you know, Apple will say, well, yeah, but that's why we have like a person at the end, you know, so if you do set off all these, you know, alarm bells, then somebody's eventually going to take a look at it and check, right? But yeah, humans can get things wrong too, right? And a picture of, you know, somebody's toddler running around in a grassy meadow, right, might be by some person misconstrued as child pornography. And if it's there amongst another, you know, bunch of other family photos that just for whatever reason happen to resemble those that they have in this database that they have no insight into, no transparency into, and of course that's on purpose, right? You know, then you're kind of shit out of luck. Now, they do say it again in that same technical brief, well, you know, if you've been mistakenly flagged, we'll provide you with a process to dispute it, right? But like, God help you if you've got to actually engage in that process. Because I would imagine that by that point, it might be a bit too late if the FBI is already knocking on your door by that point because Apple's informed on you, right? There's one thing I want to add to that as well, which, again, you know, is scary, but also I want to say this isn't something that should be overly exaggerated because they've done a lot of hard work to make sure that this is safe. But the way that the scanning on your actual device works is by having a database of all these hashes of these child porn images stored on your phone, right? Yeah, exactly. So these, to be clear, these are the hashes, right? So
Yeah.
There's a strong theoretical basis for not being able to recover these images from these hashes, right? They've worked very hard to ensure that that's like extremely difficult, if not impossible. But it still makes you a little kind of creeped out with this idea that without your consent, they're putting this on your device, right? So
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues that I had with it, and granted, this may admittedly be much better than any of the technology and garbage that YouTube uses, is, I hear what they're saying, which is we are going to use this neural network to create this perceptual hash so that it's 1 in a trillion. But I also have I have a video of Mr. Clinton that got me a content strike 2 years after I made it because it said that this was harmful and abusive, violent content.
Right.
And then I clicked to have it reviewed by a human, and him meowing for 1 minute and 17 seconds was confirmed to be harmful and abusive, violent content. And someone posted this, I'm confident that this neural network will have no bugs, and I'm confident that the human reviewer is not going to be someone making $7 a day in India clicking confirm, 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 confirm so that they can go home early. And I think that it demonstrates the technology itself sounds amazing, but this kind of demonstrates the sheer level of distrust that currently exists for the fact that so many different people piled onto this in the way that they did.
Yeah.
So there's a few questions that were here. I think I answered the first, is what are the false odds? What are the odds and false positives occurring? Second is, a technical paper suggests it uses a custom hashing algorithm that isn't publicly disclosed. How can we independently evaluate the false positive risk of 1 in 1 trillion, bearing in mind the legal implications?
The answer is you cannot. That's all there is to it. I mean, even if they were to give you the brief on the various algorithms and technologies that exist here, which they do for many of them, right? So like some of the technologies that they're using are things like private set intersection and like a bunch of other cool stuff that people in privacy and crypto and security get really excited about because they're very promising technologies and the information is out there about how they work, but you don't really get a clear view of the end-to-end system. And the transparency of how the algorithms that underlie this detection approach is completely lacking. There's no transparency there. Now, again, there's some plausibility to the claim that, well, we can't really tell you exactly how this algorithm works because if we were to do that, in order for you to be able to verify this, you'd have to have the child porn database, right? And like, obviously, we're not going to just like give that to you. It's a bunch of child porn, right? So like, why would you even want that in the first place? And so, like maybe there's some plausibility to that claim, but they don't open source any of this, right? Which would allow it to be further scrutinized. And again, making this open source doesn't mean that automatically it's like, somehow all these horrible pornographers out there are going to be able to defeat this, because that's not how it works, right? Like most crypto algorithms that are out there that make the connections, to the internet and between devices and so on and so forth that we rely on all the time, that crypto, to make that secure, it's almost always open source. That doesn't mean that people can just easily break it, right? That's just not how it works. So even knowing this implementation doesn't necessarily give you any details. But again, just to be clear, like those details aren't there. We know how the technologies are combined, and we know sort of from a technical but still marketing kind of standpoint, how Apple wants to kind of portray this technology, but we really don't know anything beyond that. And I'm sure that if you did a lot of digging, and certainly I was able to, you can find lots of white papers about these types of technologies, but you don't have any way of ensuring transparency or accountability on the actual implementation, right? And to be clear, because I know that you like to often mention this, especially when it comes to right to repair, right? That, it's not just Apple that's doing this. This is a tremendous problem that exists all over society right now. And one of them that came to light many years ago, actually, which, what made the news and is still very concerning, is that, there was a system called Compass that judges in, I think, most states across the United States were using to get guidance on sentencing decisions, right? And, because judges are overworked and the legal system is massively overburdened, they like really needed to, get these sentencing decisions out as quickly as possible so as to ensure people had fair and speedy trials and whatever, right? But this Compass system was closed source and nobody had any information about how it actually arrives at these sentencing decisions, other than, of course, again, the like technical brief and like marketing, whatever. But an independent investigation was able to discover that actually the sentencing decisions that the system makes more often than not are extremely racist. And sometimes people would get sentences that are far heavier than they should be. And sometimes people would get sentences that are far lighter than they should be. And there was no real accountability here. And there was massive lawsuits and all sorts of debacle, that occurred basically here. But people were still using the system, and I wouldn't, be surprised if there were still many judges that are still relying on this kind of technology, right? So the problem that demonstrates here is that when you start to normalize this idea that we should just be okay with these things, being used because they're trustworthy, because, like big companies spent a lot of money and effort to make sure that they're done like really, really well. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can trust that they've actually been done really, really well. There's just no transparency there, and there's really no accountability there. And so for a company like Apple, who tries to advertise themselves as not just a company that protects your privacy, but the only one in big tech that's like willing to go that extra mile to protect your privacy, that's especially concerning when they would do something like this.
Yeah, so I think it's the normalization of the trust me, bro. You don't need to see the source code
Right.
part of it while we're doing this. Is I think part of what scares people is going that step forward. Another question: as it appears to be hashed prior to upload, does it use the device's CPU capabilities, and what's its performance impact with regards to CPU read, write-where, bandwidth, battery, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question that I can only really speculate on because, of course, I would have to see the implementation to be able to comment on that in any real detail. But I will say that it's not going to be zero, right? And I will also note that sort of conspicuously absent from the white papers on this, they don't describe what the overall impact is on performance and battery life and so on and so forth. Now, for something like this, which is designed to be scanning constantly because it's constantly scanning all of the photos that you have on your system that, are also on iCloud, or maybe not in the future. But, for it to be doing that, it will certainly have a perceptible impact on the performance of your device. And it's not going to be something that's super minimal either because, and again, much of this is still speculative, but, some fairly credible authorities that I've read have said that, this technology can't be rolled out on certain Apple devices because they don't actually have the right type of CPUs or co-processing units or whatever else in order for them to do this without drastically impacting the performance of the device and essentially just like murdering your battery, right? But we all know that, Apple, while they do support devices for a fair number of years after, tends to have this sort of release cycle where they're constantly bringing out new devices. So, that probably doesn't matter to them because it's very likely that all the devices that they're going to be releasing over the next release cycle, will have the specialized hardware that's necessary to do this with minimal impact on the battery. So I wouldn't worry about that too much, honestly. I mean, I don't think that this is going to sort of, make your device die. They'll certainly have thought of that, but it's also not going to not do anything. So.
How well has this training system performed in adversarial conditions, like static fuzzing, grayscale, a turtle with an AK-47 printed on it, that kind of thing?
What, you think that they actually tell you this stuff? Like, are you kidding me?
And that's a part of the problem here is that you don't have any way to, you don't know any of this. It really is a trust me, bro system.
Yeah, no, it really is. And
a lot of people just don't want the trust me, bro system.
Right, and you shouldn't want the trust me, bro system. I mean, here's the thing, right? So, like, there, in theory, right, Apple has a lot of really, really smart engineers, right? I wouldn't even mind working for Apple amongst all of these guys because they are really smart, extremely talented. They generally really do know what they're doing. But the problem is that even if you get the smartest engineers in the world and you put them together to work on something that's, fundamentally a broken, terrible idea, they're still, no matter how great and how bulletproof their implementation of that broken, terrible idea is going to be, it's still going to be a broken and terrible idea, right? Scanning people's devices and scanning through their personal files without their consent, no matter for what the purpose is, it, in my view, is wrong. It is not okay. And I would never in a million years advocate, that child porn people should escape justice, right? They should all be in prison and they should rot in hell.
I think
but
all
the
of
thing
us are in
is,
agreement here.
yeah, I mean, obviously, right? But the thing is that when you also back the introduction of a technology like this one, something that's potentially hugely invasive, with a moral panic, like, oh my God, think of the children, there's going to be child porn, then it immediately taints people's ability to think rationally about this. And, it very easily influences people's opinions such that they say, oh, well, it's okay because really this is for a noble goal. It's all right. Right. It's the same argument that's often made for, limiting people's personal liberties when it comes to things like fighting terrorism. Right. And often it is the case, often, not always, that these techniques and these approaches aren't actually that effective, right? And I think that is potentially a reasonable argument here, because the thing is that the database that they're putting on your device with all of these known hashes of child porn images are images that they already know about, right? And so then by design, if this is a new image that doesn't happen to resemble one of these existing images, by design, they're not going to detect it. So they're not actually going to be detecting new child porn that might be getting out there. They're only just doing something to potentially mitigate the distribution of known child porn. So how does this do anything to really solve the underlying problem? They should be targeting it at its source, right? This is how police work works. Like, you don't, start creating lists of known criminals and then knock on everybody's door and bust them down and say, do you have any known criminals in this household? Right? Yeah. Like, that's not how America works. Like, that's crazy. That's essentially what they're doing just on your device. So it's in a way where you don't even know that they've kicked down the door, because it's just happening in the background without a huge performance impact potentially. So, like, what do I even care really, until suddenly the FBI starts knocking down your door, right? We just can't normalize this kind of ridiculous surveillance.
So in this system, they have this security voucher idea, which is that it creates these security vouchers that are only viewable if it passes a certain number of confirmed CSAM matched hashes. So how will teams be able to review the image to confirm it's a CSAM if the data is stored as a hash, if hashes aren't designed to tell you of what it contains? Like, is there a special decryption process for that, and how does that work separate from decrypting the rest of the material?
Yeah, so there is a special procedure for this, and that is kind of what these secure vouchers essentially do, right? So in order for the system to kind of flag, like, alert, child porn exists here, right? They do that based only on features. They don't actually, in theory, need to look at the underlying image, and that none of that information, whether it's the database that they're comparing against or the photos that might be on your device, are actually directly looked at by anything but an algorithm, which, by the way, isn't okay, right? Just because there's tons of psychology studies out there that say that people are more comfortable with algorithms scanning things versus a human doesn't make it any less invasive. But that's not the point. What's required here is for a certain number of these hits, these alerts, to occur to meet a certain threshold, which they don't tell you what it is, it's a secret. And then once you've hit or exceeded this threshold, what this sort of secure, mechanism does is it allows these items that have essentially exceeded this threshold to actually then be looked at directly, right? So it essentially does allow that original data to be looked at. It goes beyond, at that stage, just the featureized hashed versions of the content. So, in theory, what this should do then is allow a human to be the overriding yes or no about whether or not, the images that they're flagged as child porn, once they've reached that certain threshold of number of images, that is, and they would have the final decision. But as you pointed out as well, again, we have no idea who these people are. We have no idea what incentives they have. We have no idea what biases they have. We have no idea what process they even use to judge these things. And so there's really just, we have no idea what happens after that point. Just somebody's going to look at it and they're going to make the ultimate decision, yes or no, about whether to inform on that particular user.
Okay, now this is obviously more of a question for someone that actually works at this company, and this is a question that I'm likely that even if you were speaking to someone who did, you never get an honest answer for. Is there a risk that non-CSAM material may be added to this database that may end up implicating people? Like, how vulnerable is this to mission creep? And I think this is an issue, particularly when discussing other countries that may want, I don't know, Xi Jinping may be really pissed off if there's Winnie the Pooh on it, or some sort of meme on there, and it gets kind of scary when you get to that point.
Yeah, well, so here's the thing, right? So, right now, Apple swears up and down that this is really only just for searching child porn and there's a limited database and that's how it works, right? But it is, of course, possible for this to be abused in that way. And the only way that you can prevent that kind of abuse is to just not develop these systems. Because what happens when Apple, in order to comply with some new directive in China, ends up having to extend this database to also include whatever political slogans they want, whatever political imagery they want, literally anything that they want, right? It could literally just be pictures of Winnie the Pooh, right? So what happens in that type of situation is you end up with a extremely powerful surveillance tool that, under the guise of protecting the privacy of the broad set of users generally here for this child porn purpose, can then also completely eliminate any possible transparency for who is essentially being monitored here, and what they're being monitored about and why, and then what the consequences are going to be. So, it's really easy for you to convince people that this might be okay for something like child porn, because everybody thinks that child porn is like, abhorrent, right? But it's so easy for this to then change its mission. Like you said, this mission creep notion, it would be trivial to do that. There's nothing that is preventing this database from being added to or manipulated in any way other than trust me, bro. Right?
Do you think that it's somewhat unfair that this came out in the news with Apple, in spite of the fact that, let's say, Microsoft or Google or others all have something similar, similar to this, except they're doing the scanning server side versus client side? Because essentially, when you're
sorry, go ahead.
No, because let's say if you're sharing a meme or something that's politically incorrect, or a picture of something that someone in government at that point in time may not want you to have, and there is mission creep, I mean, most of those are not just being shared solely on your device. They're being shared via Google Hangouts, Facebook Messenger, and everything else. So at this point, I mean, a lot of the concerns that people do have with the system, I think they're just starting to wake up to the fact that these systems exist and are being used, and likely should have, if anything, started getting aggravated at their existence 2 to 5 years ago.
I mean, yeah, like this stuff exists everywhere already. But I think, though, that people kind of have this correct kind of contextual notion that, if you're going to be uploading something to Facebook, then other people are going to see it, and it's really not actually private. And so whether it's something that is god awful, like child porn, or hate speech imagery, or like executions, or like God knows what, right? That, there should be something there to scan for that and then prevent it from being shared around, right? And that already is a hard problem that Facebook really struggles with. But this scanning happens through your email. It happens through cloud storage providers. This is a normal thing, and it's been happening for years and years, especially for ensuring that content piracy doesn't happen either, right? But the issue here is that it has never been done on your device through your personal files that you are supposed to have like absolute control and privacy over.
Yeah, because right? One of the responses that I saw to this was, well, I mean, you should be mad that all these others are doing it. You're just getting mad now that it's happening client side, when this has been happening server side for a very long time with these types of technologies that can compare everything to everything in a database. And I don't disagree with them. Many people probably should have been really aggravated several years ago. It seems odd that this would be the hill where people get incredibly aggravated and choose to die on. But at this point, what else is there to really do?
Well, I mean, the problem here is that, okay, maybe if we were thinking about these things more deeply, say 10 years ago, when they really started to happen in earnest, across the internet, then we might have been able to do something about it, but we're too late, right? It's already pervasive. But this is the first foray to doing this on people's devices. And so we still have an opportunity to make sure that this isn't something that's accepted by society. And people can stand up and say, hey, like, no, this really isn't okay. The problem with that, though, which is very much like the argument that, again, comes from Right to Repair, that people say, oh, well, yeah, you hate Apple, just like don't buy an Apple device, right? It doesn't work that way. Every other provider is going to start doing this now because they'll say, look, Apple, the most privacy conscious company, has done this, and they effectively have gotten away with it. So I guess we should probably do it too. Otherwise, we're going to look bad, right? And the framing for this, especially around something like child pornography, it works really well because then every single company can do this. And if they say, well, we don't want you to do this, like this is bad, this is violating people's privacy, they can just as easily turn around and say, oh, so you like child porn, huh? Like it doesn't make sense. You can't use these moral panics to essentially justify, shifting the whole paradigm into surveillance, into pervasive surveillance. Again, cloud providers, whatever, they tell you outright, like, we are scanning the stuff that you put on here. And there's very limited exceptions to that, right? Like if you have like a, corporate Google Apps account or something like that, then they won't scan through your emails. There's contracts that exist there that prevent it. So another argument actually that kind of extends from this is a lot of people are asking the question, well, is Apple going to offer this for their corporate clients? Like, is there going to be a way to turn this off? Because aren't they going to turn off companies? Since obviously there is this like right potential for abuse, and Apple could, in theory, potentially steal secrets and whatever else, through this scheme, which, like, again, is probably not that likely. But all the same, there isn't any, there hasn't been any mention of this by Apple. So even if you are like a huge corporate company, a customer rather of theirs, you're kind of shit out of luck. Everybody gets their files scanned.
So it seems like the hill to die on was a long time ago, and having it be this client side the client side comparing all of this to existing hashes is kind of a little too late to push back on this, it seems like. What do you think would be the ideal outcome of everything that's occurred over the past week? Like, from a privacy standpoint, would the ideal thing to be they turn back on it, or they just, what is there to really...
I picked out wearing this t-shirt that says on it, like, privacy is not dead, because I actually believe that privacy isn't dead yet, but it's probably on life support. And so I think at this point, if we're going to, sort of as a society, do anything about this, we have to be vocal about it. And we have to make sure that people are aware of this problem, and ensure that they know that they are being subject to it and without their consent. But I think ultimately what this is going to take, because Apple's not going to just turn around on this, right? Like, this is coming on their next iOS update. It's too late. The cat's out of the bag, right? But as a society, if we're going to sort of change this around, we need to advocate in the United States for a fundamental right to privacy, like what exists in Europe. I mean, one of the terrible, terrible ironies that exists out there is after the GDPR was introduced across Europe in 2018 and people started to have a fundamental right to privacy, right? People were pissed off as a result of targeted ads that were super invasive and all of the behavioral profiling and so on and so on and so on that was happening without their consent, right? The terrible irony here is that even China woke up to it. And China actually implemented comprehensive privacy laws. And, you can rightly say, okay, well, like, what does this even matter? Because, in China, like, the government's going to spy on you anyways. Like, it's a little bit, of just sort of a virtue signaling thing anyway. But even still, they were willing to do that there, right? Like, they copied the European data protection regulation almost wholesale. And so, at least from a purely theoretical legal standpoint, Chinese citizens actually have more comprehensive privacy rights than people do in the United States. Maybe not when it comes to government surveillance, but at least when it comes to private companies, right? Apple is a private company. We need a fundamental right to privacy in the United States. We need to have ownership over our own data, just like how right to repair is about establishing ownership over your actual physical devices that you own. You should have a right to your data, your content that you create. And part of that right should extend to the fact that you should not be subject to warrantless surveillance without, even being able to give your consent to it. Privacy is fundamentally about choice. And so we need to make sure that there is something that exists to maintain our right to have a choice to opt out. But we don't. So
thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate this. Where can people find you, more of your work, and what it is you're doing?
Yeah, well, people can find me at danielsmollen.com, although really what you're going to find is just sort of like my CV and a bunch of projects that I've been working on. Right now I'm at the tail end of finishing up my PhD in privacy and security at Carnegie Mellon. And then I'm going to be on the job market. So if you want to hire me, get in touch, right? But other than that, send me an email. It's really easy to find, ways to contact me. I'm very happy to answer your questions. Please don't give me the hug of death, because I know that, Lewis has like 2 million subscribers by now or something. But yeah. But anyway, I would like people to ask me questions, but also I would like to use this as an opportunity to shout out the work that we're doing on the repair repository and the repair wiki, right? Because we are still looking for people to help us with this effort. This is an important effort. We need people to contribute content to the wiki and to help us come up with the design for this next generation repair repository that will have information about repairing common devices out there. This is, again, one of those ways that we can kind of take the power back. And so, it's been great talking to Lewis and Jessa and the others about this project. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And,
my pleasure.
Have a good day.
You too.